What if the oldest name for a monster isn't a warning, but a sentence? We use its name for anything and everything vast and terrifying, but we've forgotten the story of its birth, a story that has nothing to do with the blind rage of nature, only cold, merciless calculation, the legend of two creatures being made and one of them being immediately destroyed. So that the world might live, the other was condemned to be alone, forever, in the silent darkness of the abyss. Not a monster, but a lonely guardian at the threshold of the end of time, and it is still waiting. Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode on cryptids and monsters. As always, I appreciate the mountain of suggestions you've sent in. I'd previously asked for ideas on two themes: cryptids of gargantuan size, or creatures of a more supernatural, paranormal nature. Judging by your responses, some worthy candidates have emerged. Today, I'm going to talk about one of them, a creature, I might add, that has been suggested before. The only reason I've steered clear of this particular cryptid in the past is its deep ties to biblical sources. Anything touching on religion or specific chapters of the Bible is a can of worms I'd rather not open. Not because I don't want to discuss it, but because I have no desire for our conversation to devolve into a religious debate, much like I avoid talking politics. Some things should remain private. However, when I took a closer look at the information about this creature, stripping away the biblical lore and analyzing it just like any other cryptid or monster I've covered, I found a number of truly extraordinary characteristics. If this creature really does still exist, and some sources suggest it does, then something dwells in the ocean depths that could rival the largest cryptids I've ever discussed, like Zaratan or, of course, the bloop from my very first episode. The creature in question is the Leviathan. I'm sure every one of us has heard the word. What's interesting is that the name itself has taken on a life of its own, becoming more of a term than a proper name. Today, any massive animal, sometimes even a land dweller, might be called a Leviathan, using the word as a descriptor, not the name of a specific being. But our cryptid's name is, precisely, Leviathan. All known accounts of this creature come from the Old Testament and certain Judaic sacred texts. And in sharing this information, I'll repeat that I won't be quoting things like chapter this, verse that, as it would drag us into a biblical discussion, a territory I'd rather not venture into here. Instead, I'm going to focus on what makes this cryptid stand out, on its unique features. Again, Leviathan is a pretty watered-down term these days. Countless giant monsters bear the name across all sorts of media: books, comics, movies, you name it. Sooner or later, you're bound to run into another creature called Leviathan. The last example I can recall was in the game Resistance, which featured a giant, enormous creature called the Leviathan. It's a perfect illustration. So, who or what is the Leviathan? According to the sources, in this case the Old Testament and the collection of texts known as the Tanakh, this creature came into being at the very, very earliest stages of Earth's formation. Those who subscribe to the version of God creating the planet in a matter of days claim it was created on the fifth day. Those who approach it from a more scientific standpoint might equate these days with early geological eras and conclude that the Leviathan appeared at the very dawn of life on the planet, not necessarily at the moment of its creation, but during that early period when the Earth had already become habitable and could sustain life. The legend goes that when God created the Leviathan, he also created a mate for it. However, given the creature's size, which I'll get to in a few minutes, the female was immediately destroyed. The reasoning was that if something so gigantic so colossal, were to reproduce, creating offspring that would in turn have more offspring, and so on, it would be a burden the entire planet could not bear. I found this detail particularly fascinating because it immediately brought to mind the recent Godzilla films. Think about the 2014 movie. Part of the plot is centered on the idea that the Muto offspring must be destroyed, because even two of those creatures bring colossal destruction to a city. Imagine a whole swarm of them infesting different corners of the world. It would be impossible to deal with them without resorting to extreme measures like nuclear warheads, which would, in turn, create even greater chaos. The 1998 Godzilla film also touched on this theme in the scene with Godzilla's babies. There was that key moment when Matthew Broderick's character says that if those little raptors are allowed to get out, they could become the dominant species on the planet. So, this idea was reflected in the biblical legend, and that is precisely why the female was destroyed, leaving the male to live in solitude. Now let's get to some of the curious facts about the surviving male. He is, by all accounts, the only known member of his species, and he has been spotted several times in the world. If this Leviathan is still out there, down in the deep, and the sources claim it is, then let's start with its size. The creature's dimensions are gargantuan. I mean, it's colossal. Something unimaginably massive, probably far larger than the bloop I talked about in my first video. But perhaps not as large as Zaratan, and only because Zaratan, as I described in my video on it, was the size of a small island, which is why I still consider it the largest cryptid of them all. And a small island can be several hundred miles across. As for our creature, its size is described as follows. A man by the name of Yohanan Bar Napaha, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, described an encounter with this beast. He said, "Once we were traveling on a ship, and we saw a fish that put its head out of the water. It had horns on which was written, 'I am one of the meanest creatures that inhabit the sea. I am 300 miles in length, and I am going into the mouth of the Leviathan this day.'" If we take this account literally, we're looking at a creature 300 miles long, which is almost on par with Zaratan, again, depending on just how big the island that Zaratan was supposed to be. 300 miles. That is monstrously huge. It's a gigantic size, dwarfing anything you and I can possibly imagine when we talk about cryptids, with the possible exception of Zaratan. And as far as size goes, this is the only known account that gives specific dimensions for the creature. So it's definitely a top contender, maybe even the single largest cryptid I can think of. Any ideas you had before, based on other works of fiction, like that Resistance game I mentioned? The Leviathan there was huge, several hundred feet tall, but several hundred feet versus several hundred miles in length. They're not even in the same league. Another remarkable feature of this creature was its unique abilities, particularly its method of attack. According to descriptions, it was capable of breathing fire, spewing orange-hued flames from its body. What creature immediately springs to mind when you think of a giant, fire-breathing monster? Of course, it brings Godzilla to mind, but in this case, we're talking about a Godzilla on a completely different, hyper-gargantuan scale, something that vastly exceeds the size of anything we know. Another unique trait of this creature was its eyes. Apparently, they possessed a powerful, light-emitting force. By the way, all the depictions of the Leviathan you might see are purely artistic license, because unfortunately, not a single specific and detailed description of its appearance has survived, aside from mentions of its colossal size. Everything about this creature's appearance is left entirely to our imagination, opening the door for the wildest interpretations. There were even legends that the Leviathan wasn't a giant fish, as one might assume, but rather a colossal crocodile. So your mental image, or my mental image of this monster, is 100% a product of our own creativity. That's why you can find such a wide variety of its depictions in different sources. So, back to the eyes. They apparently emitted a brilliant, blinding light. This phenomenon was described in another passage from the book of Job, which says, "By his neesings a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning." Something terrified Job, namely, the appearance of two bright lights. And although he couldn't see the Leviathan itself at that moment, he mentioned this light as a harbinger of its approach. Another key characteristic of the Leviathan was, apparently, the extremely powerful odor that emanated from its body. The stench was so unbearable that no living creature could withstand it. This makes perfect sense if you assume the creature lived in the depths of the sea, and whenever it neared land where animals were present, its smell would either send them into a panicked flight or simply kill them. Where exactly this creature has resided for centuries remains unknown. However, the descriptions and eyewitness accounts, from the biblical Job to Rabbi Yohanan bar Nappaha, indicate just how ancient this creature is. The events they speak of took place thousands and thousands of years ago, which means the Leviathan has existed on Earth since time immemorial. Speaking of this creature, there's another notable legend tied to the Bible. The story goes that the Leviathan had a run-in with Jonah, another famous biblical figure. According to the tale, the fish that swallowed Jonah, and this was a massive fish, mind you, was nearly eaten whole by the Leviathan. Just picture the scene. Anyone who remembers that moment from the Phantom Menace with the two giant fish will know exactly what I'm talking about. The heroes were crossing an ocean in a submarine when a monstrous predator started chasing them. Just as it was about to swallow their ship, an even more colossal monster appeared out of nowhere. If anyone remembers what that beast was called, drop it in the comments. This new predator snatched up its gigantic fellow, which was many times smaller, and devoured it like an appetizer. The legend of the Leviathan almost making a meal of the fish that swallowed Jonah brings that exact scene to mind. But here's where it gets interesting. As huge and mighty as the Leviathan was, you'd think it had no enemies. But you'd be wrong. There was something that it, in turn, was terrified of. And the reason for this fear was that while nothing outmatched the Leviathan in size, size isn't everything when it comes to the ability to do harm. In this case, the Leviathan was afraid, yes, afraid, according to the sources, of a tiny worm called the kilbit. It's unknown just how small this worm was, but it was minuscule compared to the Leviathan. Maybe it was the size of a common earthworm as we know it, or, given the Leviathan's scale, perhaps it was as long as several buses, but it was still just a worm next to the sea titan. In any case, this kilbit, whatever it was, would latch onto the Leviathan's gills, which, by the way, is another clue about its anatomy, pointing to giant gills, and kill it. Exactly how it did this, nobody knows. Maybe it devoured the Leviathan from the inside out, or perhaps it infected it with some incurable plague. Given the kilbit's tiny size, the Leviathan was utterly powerless once the worm attached itself. Any attempt to, say, rip out its own gills would have only caused more self-inflicted damage. It's just another fascinating piece of the Leviathan puzzle. Beyond that, the details get a bit scarce. The idea that the Leviathan still exists comes from biblical prophecy. According to these prophecies, the Leviathan will live on until it is slain at the end of days, when the righteous enter paradise. Its flesh will be so vast and plentiful that this single creature will be enough for all who are welcomed into the kingdom of heaven to feast upon. If this prophecy holds true, it means the Leviathan is still alive, even today. After all, until paradise calls the saved home, this 300-mile-long beast is still prowling the seas, probably somewhere in the Atlantic or Pacific, though its original home is said to be the Mediterranean. It's a chilling, yet mesmerizing thought that something so massive and potentially lethal is still lurking in the depths. The moment someone actually comes face to face with a creature like that, you can bet it would be the most viral news story the world has ever seen. But until that day, all we have are the ancient texts claiming that this colossal creature, one of a kind, a male, is still out there in the world's oceans. If anyone has other, more modern legends about the Leviathan, please share them in the comments. I'd be fascinated to hear them, since everything we've talked about, all the sources and eyewitness accounts, are hundreds, if not thousands, of years old. More recent phenomena that get thrown into the mix include the mysterious bloop sound, or the myths of the Zaratan, which I've covered in the context of other cryptids. Some even theorize that when Old Testament witnesses discovered the Leviathan, they hadn't encountered some mythical monster, but rather the last surviving dinosaur, a creature that lived on into an age when its kind was long extinct, leading them to misinterpret what it truly was. It's another compelling theory about what the Leviathan might have actually been. Again, if you have any more recent stories, drop them below. Thanks for tuning in. Stay safe.